Hi, everybody. This should be, with any luck, the last class that we are having over Zoom. Obviously, next week is spring break, so there aren't any classes next week. And I'm starting to feel better anyway. I'm like 90% better, so I should be totally fine by the week after spring break. Shouldn't be a problem. Obviously, if anything changes, I will keep you guys up to date. Keep in mind that the next class, which is March 7th, so not next week, but the week after that, after spring break, the next class is exam 2. Also keep in mind that I told you after exam 1 that exam 2 tends to be the most difficult exam. It's the one that students struggle with the most. So knowing that, you might want to put aside a couple extra hours studying for this exam. Okay, so just keep that in mind going into exam 2. I posted the study guide online in Canvas, so you should have access to that. Also, I just a few minutes ago got a list from my student Laura of all the students who did the extra credit for exam 1. So I will post that probably sometime tomorrow. Okay, so just be patient, that will get up there in Canvas as well. Obviously, for the exam, you're responsible for everything we talked about since exam 1 up till the end of this class. So the last thing we talked about for exam 1 was the spotlight effect. Everything after that is going to be on this exam. So that I think that starts with self-presentation and self-monitoring. So just a couple of the last slides at the end of the section on the self you're responsible for. Then we talked about social cognition, attributions, attitudes, and cognitive dissonance and self-perception theory, which we're going to cover today. So we should just get to the end of the cognitive dissonance section today, and then we'll have a quiz, and then that'll be it for exam 2. So let's jump in and let me share my screen with you guys. So just to refresh your memory as to what we were talking about when we left off last class, I had introduced the idea of cognitive dissonance theory, one of the most important theories in all of social psychology. And the basic idea is that we like all of our thoughts and our beliefs and our behaviors to be consistent with one another, but sometimes we will engage in a behavior that conflicts with some sort of attitude or some value or some belief that we have. And under those conditions, when that happens, we will tend to experience this negative, aversive physiological arousal. And that arousal is known as cognitive dissonance. It makes us uncomfortable. We feel kind of hypocritical, for instance. And when we experience that physical or physiological arousal, that cognitive dissonance, we have a number of psychological mechanisms that we use to try to reduce that dissonance. In particular, I talked about 5 different psychological strategies that we have to reduce our cognitive dissonance. Things like changing our attitude, changing our behavior, minimizing the importance of the conflict, etc. We talked about those last class. So what I'd like to do for the first few minutes is just give you some hypothetical examples where people might experience cognitive dissonance, and so to see if we can come up with ideas of how these people might reduce that dissonance. And this is important in partly for exam 2, and also partly because the assignment I will be giving you on exam day on March 7th, that assignment is going to have you do this sort of activity. It's going to give you a scenario and you're going to have to analyze it to figure out how people reduce their cognitive dissonance and what other mechanisms they could have used to reduce their dissonance. So let's take the following scenario. Ed is a big believer in Ouija boards and has used them hundreds of times. He has recently been told that Ouija board phenomena are the result of the ideomotor effect, and they do not let people talk to the dead. Okay, so imagine that Ed is a student in this class and he's used Ouija boards. And if you've used Ouija boards, then you know how they work. Here's the basic idea. You can see down here, this little heart-shaped contraption is known as a planchette. And the planchette has 3 little legs on it. And at the bottom of each leg is a little tiny piece of felt. So it slides really, really easily over this board, the Ouija board. And you have 2 people lightly place their hands on the planchette, just like you can see in the picture here. And supposedly what you do is people ask questions and then ghosts and dead people answer the questions by moving the planchette to various letters that spell out words. Okay. Of course, Ouija boards don't really let people talk to the dead. There's no such thing as people talking to the dead. But rather what happens is something known as the ideomotor effect. So the basic idea is that if you're to hold out your hand completely straight, as still as possible, what you'll notice is that you can't quite do it. There's like little tiny shakes and tremors in your hand. And what happens is that when you lay your hands really gently on the planchette, those little tiny tremors get translated into movement on the planchette because the planchette slips so easily on that surface. Those little movements can easily slide around on that board. And when you ask a question, if you have an expectation of what you think the answer is going to be or what you're expecting it to be, those expectations can unconsciously get transmitted basically through those little movements in your hands. And basically what that means is you are actually moving that planchette around on your own. And you don't realize necessarily that you're in control of it, but you're completely in control of it the whole time. But because you don't realize you're in control of it, it feels like an outside source is actually moving that planchette around, which is why people think it lets them talk to the dead, but it doesn't actually do that. That's a well-known psychological effect. So imagine that Ed is a student in this class, and Ed believes that he's used Ouija boards many times to talk to the dead, and now he's just learned that, in fact, it's the result of the ideomotor effect. So that is going to potentially create some cognitive dissonance. So we want to look at some ways that Ed might have to reduce that dissonance. First off, when answering these questions, though, you need to identify what the discrepancy is between. Okay, so identify what the attitude is and what the behavior is that's discrepant. So in this case, that would be Ed is using Ouija boards, but if Ed were to believe my explanation for them, then he would have to accept that Ouija boards don't let him talk to the dead. So in which case, why is he using Ouija boards? So that's the discrepancy that is going to produce that cognitive dissonance. So how might he reduce his dissonance? Let's look at a couple of possible ways. Well, first off, Ed could change his attitude. So if his attitude is that Ouija board phenomena are the result of the ideomotor effect, well, he could simply not believe my explanation, right? He can dismiss my explanation and say, and still continue to believe that in fact, it's dead people and ghosts that are moving that planchette around. That's possible. Now you should note that that sounds or is quite similar to confirmation bias, right? So remember, the confirmation bias says that once we believe something, we look only for information that supports our initial belief and we dismiss other types of evidence. And part of the reason why the confirmation bias exists is because if we were to accept contradictory information to what we already believe, that would produce cognitive dissonance. So there's a relationship here between confirmation bias and cognitive dissonance. So Ed might simply dismiss my claims that Ouija board phenomena are the result of the ideomotor effect. A second way that he might use to reduce his cognitive dissonance would be to change his behavior. So if his behavior is using Ouija boards, he could simply stop using Ouija boards, and suddenly that would be consistent with his new belief that Ouija board phenomena are simply the result of the ideomotor effect. But there are other strategies he could use as well. He could, for instance, add a consonant cognition. So a consonant cognition, remember, is a new belief that's consistent with either the attitude or the behavior that are in conflict. So the basic idea here is he could say something like, yeah, I use Ouija boards, but I use them as sort of a social activity, a fun thing to do with friends, right? So in that case, he's adding a new belief, which is that I use Ouija boards as a bonding experience or as a social activity, which is consistent with his behavior. Or Ed could minimize the importance of the conflict. He could say something like, well, yeah, I use Ouija boards, but I don't take it really seriously, or I don't do it that often, or something along that lines, where he acknowledges that there's a conflict between his behavior and his attitude, but it doesn't really matter. It's not really important. And finally, he could reduce his perceived choice. He could say something like, well, the only times I play with Ouija boards is when I'm at a party and people bring it out. I have to go along with it because that's what everyone else is doing. So I don't really have a choice in the matter. I'm kind of forced to go along. And that would also reduce his cognitive dissonance. So what you can see here is that there are numerous mechanisms or numerous ways that we can reduce our cognitive dissonance. People will generally choose the way that's easiest for them in the moment. But there are numerous ways that we have of reducing our dissonance. So now what I would like you guys to do is I want you to give me some answers, some ways that people might reduce their dissonance in these hypothetical scenarios. And you're going to do that by writing in the chat. So imagine the following. John has always claimed that he wanted to date girls that were intelligent and generous, and that attractiveness doesn't matter to him. Recently, he met Kate, who's extremely attractive, but but not intelligent and somewhat self-centered. Nonetheless, John dates her. So imagine you're friends with John and he starts dating this woman who, although attractive, is not intelligent and self-centered. And you call him out for his past statements where he says that that's exactly the type of woman he wouldn't date. That should produce some cognitive dissonance, right? He's got an attitude, which is that I don't date this type of woman, and he's got a behavior, which is I am dating this type of woman. If that creates cognitive dissonance, how might he reduce that cognitive dissonance? And I want you guys to give me some answers by writing into chats. Okay, so let's see. He could say that intelligence isn't that important. Now, he could do that, which is effectively changing his attitude to bring it in line with his behavior. The problem is, if he's already publicly stated that intelligence doesn't matter to him, or intelligence does matter to him, then he's kind of contradicting his past statements. So it's kind of hard to do, although theoretically he could try something like that. But it'd be harder to pull that off. So change behavior, what does that mean when you say change behavior? Be specific. She has other good qualities. So yeah, did I not tell you guys that I value loyalty? Loyalty, she's really loyal, this person, right? So what he's doing is suddenly he's shifting his focus to some other characteristic, or in other words, he's adding a consonant cognition. He's adding a belief that's consistent with his behavior. I value loyalty and she's loyal, and that's why I'm dating her. That's certainly important. He could say she's smarter in other areas. Yeah, that's a similar sort of thing. You know, she's not book smarts, but she's got all these street smarts, and that's what really matters, right? So he starts focusing on that. That's like adding a consonant cognition as well. Yeah, he could simply deny that she isn't intelligent. He could convince himself that she's more intelligent and more generous than she really is. He can kind of delude himself that way to make him feel like he's being consistent. Change his behavior, he could stop dating her. Yep, absolutely. Minimize the importance of the conflict. So you said being intelligent is not a big problem. There's actually a better example for minimizing the importance of the conflict. So remember, minimizing the importance of the conflict means that you're saying that the conflict exists, but it's not a big deal for some reason. So in other words, yeah, I said I liked intelligent women. She's not an intelligent woman, but it doesn't really matter because this is just casually dating. I'm not going to marry her, right? This is not going to be like my life partner. I just doing it for fun. That's an example of minimizing the importance of the conflict. What else? There's at least one more I can think of. No one's mentioned reduce perceived choice. What's an example of reducing perceived choice in this case? Like if he convinces himself he was forced to date her. I don't know what chapter exactly this is. It's probably in the attitude section. She asked me out, I didn't want to hurt her feelings. Okay, that's not bad. So you could say like, I sort of like had to say yes. I was sort of forced to say yes because I didn't want to hurt her feelings. That's fine. Yeah, he could, okay, intelligent women aren't attracted to him. So he could say that, well, if intelligent women aren't attracted to me, I have no choice. I have to date unintelligent women. Okay, it's a good example. Or it could just be something like there are no other single women that I know, so I have to date her. Regardless, those are all strategies that would work to reduce his cognitive dissonance though. What about this one? You have plenty of food to eat and receive high quality medical care. Millions of people in the world are starving and don't have access to the simplest of medical treatments. If you gave more money to charity, you could save lives. Okay, well, first off, let's identify what the attitude and the behavior is. So in this case, the attitude is something like we think of ourselves as good people, as people who care about others. We have empathy and we have concern about other people, and yet our inaction has led other people to be harmed, right? If you accept this premise. So how do I reconcile the fact that I think I'm a good person and yet I'm not doing things to help people? That's where the conflict comes into play, right? So what are some ways that people could reduce their dissonance? Okay, so I don't have enough money to give. Yeah, so I'm a poor college student. I don't have any money. If I had money, I could give it, but I don't have any money. And to the extent that you can convince yourself you have no money, you're reducing your perceived choice, right? So you had no choice in the matter. I don't trust the charities. Yeah, absolutely. Charities aren't trustworthy. Absolutely. So you could say something like, well, if I donated money, it's not going to get to the people in need anyway, so it doesn't really matter that I'm not doing anything. What you're doing in that case is you're minimizing the importance of the conflict. You're saying, yeah, I don't donate money, even though I care about people, but it doesn't matter because it wouldn't get to the people anyway. So you're minimizing the importance of the conflict. That's good. You could start donating, which would be changing your behavior, not your attitude. But if you change your behavior, that means you could start donating to charities. Sure. Feeling your money isn't sufficient enough to make a huge impact. Yeah, so absolutely. That's something like minimizing the importance of the conflict. Like I could donate money, but it doesn't really matter because people aren't going to be able to use it in a way that helps them significantly. Yeah, these are all good examples. None of my friends donate, so that's interesting. So that is effectively a kind of a false consensus effect, right? So what you're doing is you're saying, well, I'm engaging in an undesirable behavior, which is not donating money, which leads us to be motivated to overestimate how many other people also don't donate money. And to the extent that you can convince yourself of that, then that should alleviate some of that guilt. So that would work as well. Others donate, so I don't need to. So that's kind of like saying, well, I don't need to because the people who need the money are already getting it from other sources, so it doesn't really matter that I'm not donating. So that's minimizing the importance of the conflict. Okay, so you could say something like, yeah, I don't donate to charity, but I did give $5 to a homeless guy last week, right? And by thinking about those other instances in which you help people, well, that's consistent with your attitude that you're a good person, right? So if you start talking about all the other good things that you do, you're effectively adding consonant cognitions. That's a good example. I think the only one you didn't mention is kind of a weird one anyway. Changing your attitude, which would be admitting that you don't really care about other people, which although theoretically you could use to reduce your cognitive dissonance, probably is not going to be used by most people because we want to maintain a really positive view of ourselves as well, right? But you guys mentioned all the others. Changing your behavior would be start donating money to charity, adding consonant cognitions, adding the other, or thinking about the other ways that you help people, minimizing the importance of the conflict, reducing perceived choice, saying you have no money. Okay, great. These are all good examples that you guys are giving me for reducing cognitive dissonance. Imagine that you're part of a group that thinks the world will end on October 21st, 2011. This is a real organization that believes this. You sell all of your possessions and you cut up all your family members to prepare for the final days. October 21st passes and the world doesn't end. So this was a real group, some people might call them a cult, that believed the world was going to end. The start of the end of the world was going to happen on May 21st. And then the final end of the world was going to happen on October 21st, 2011. People put billboards all over the country. People were like touring around in these giant buses talking about the so-called awesome news that the world was going to end. These ladies are way too happy considering they literally believe the world's going to end, and they're really smiling a lot, strangely enough. Anyway, imagine that you're one of these people, right? So you're in this organization and your friends and your family think that you're a little bit crazy for joining this group. So you have to cut them off, right? You have to sort of cut off your friends and family so you don't hear that criticism. And because the world's ending, you sell all your possessions and you quit your job because you don't need a job if the world ends. And so you've thrown everything you believe into this one belief. And then that belief is proven wrong. How are you going to deal with that? I mean, after all, you probably think that you're an intelligent, well-informed decision maker. And yet, if you admit that your belief was wrong, then you made some massive mistakes, some massive decision-making mistakes by quitting your job and cutting off your friends. That's going to create massive amounts of cognitive dissonance. So what are you going to do? How are you going to deal with this? Well, the leader of this organization, his name was Harold Camping. After the May 21st date, which was the beginning of the end of the world, okay? When May 21st came, and nothing happened. After that happened, he was interviewed by someone. And Harold Camping said some things in that interview that I think reveals the nature of the cognitive dissonance that he was experiencing at the time. Here's what he said. He said the following: "I can tell you very candidly that when May 21st came and went, it was a very difficult time. I was wondering what is going on. In my mind, I went back through all the promises God has made, all the proofs, all the signs, and everything was fitting perfectly. So what in the world happened? I really was praying and praying, oh Lord, what happened?" What the interviewer concluded was that what he decided apparently was that May 21st had been an invisible judgment day of the spiritual variety. So a couple things I think to note from this paragraph here. First off, note that Harold Camping is going through some severe psychological torment after his predictions turned out to be false, right? So he's saying it's a very difficult time. I'm praying, oh Lord, what happened? He's expressing the psychological anguish that he's experiencing because he's so publicly committed to this idea that the world was going to end, and he engaged in all these behaviors given that the world was going to end, preaching it to everybody around the country, as many people who would listen. And if he were to believe that he was wrong, how does he justify all of those behaviors? So he's experiencing that psychological, that cognitive dissonance. And the second thing to note from this is the way in which he resolves that cognitive dissonance. He decided that May 21st had been an invisible judgment day of the spiritual variety, whatever that means, right? He is searching for a way to resolve the dissonance that's created, that would be created if he were to accept that he was wrong. So what he does is he latches on to this belief that in fact he was sort of right. It was an invisible judgment day, right? And if he can convince himself that in fact May 21st was some sort of judgment day, then his past actions, he can justify them to some extent. So that's how he resolved his cognitive dissonance in this case. And this type of cognitive dissonance is a little bit different than the way that we've been talking about it prior to this. This type of cognitive dissonance refers to a second domain in which we tend to see a lot of cognitive dissonance effects. So the first domain occurs when we engage in a behavior that contradicts our attitudes, and we have to then justify that behavior. That's how we've been talking about cognitive dissonance so far. Well, how we're going to talk about it now is in a different domain where we exert or we expend a lot of effort to join a group, say. And if we expend a lot of effort in order to do something, we feel a need to justify why we expended all of that effort. So if you are trying to join a group and you go through some sort of initiation, yeah, someone just mentioned it, in sororities and fraternities, you go through some sort of fraternity initiation or something, and you go through this suffering for, let's say, a week in order to get into that group. If you get into the fraternity and you all of a sudden realize, wait a second, I don't want to be here anyway. Well, man, then why did you go through all that suffering for the whole week when you were being hazed, when you're being initiated, right? That's going to create a lot of this cognitive dissonance, because again, if you think of yourself as an intelligent decision maker, but you decided to suffer for a group you didn't even like, well, that calls into question your intelligence, right? So what that means is that when we expend all this effort to join a group, we need to justify it somehow. And one of the ways that we can justify it is by convincing ourselves that the group is totally worth it, right? So if I suffer to get into a group, if I convince myself this group is amazing and I love to be a part of this group, well, that justifies having suffered for it. So people will come to convince themselves they really like something because they suffered for it, as a way to reduce the dissonance that would be created otherwise. Or in other words, we justify that for which we suffer. In fact, we've sort of already seen this in this class, because if we rewind to the beginning of the semester in like the second week, I think, we talked about a study in the context of research methods. I just use this as an example to talk about how a study gets designed and how we interpret the results of that study. And at the time I mentioned that the underlying theory, the reason for the hypothesis that we had talked about in that study, was something we're going to talk about later. Well, now is that time later. So the basic idea is that cognitive dissonance theory makes the prediction that people will justify things that they suffer for by convincing themselves they really like it. And so that led researchers to conduct this study. Now, I've already talked about this study, but just to refresh your memory, here's what they did. These were college-age women who signed up to participate in a study in which all they knew was that they were going to be involved in a discussion about sex. That's all they knew. When they get to the lab, they're met by a male experimenter who randomly assigns them to one of 3 conditions. Women in the control condition are immediately allowed to join the group discussion. The other 2 groups of women are assigned to undergo basically an initiation. So half of those women undergo a mild initiation where they have to read off a list of mildly sexually suggestive words, but not really a big deal. And the other half of those women have to undergo this more severe initiation where they have to read off a list of very explicit sexually suggestive words, which to those women should be pretty embarrassing to do in front of this male experimenter. So this is kind of mimicking sort of being initiated and undergoing the suffering in order to join this group. But after that initiation, all the women are allowed to join the group. Now, when they join the group, they're going into a private booth and they put headphones on, and they're told because it's their first time, they're just going to be listening to the group discussion, when in reality, they're hearing a recorded conversation. And the recorded conversation they're hearing is described by the researchers themselves as one of the most worthless and uninteresting discussions imaginable. Okay, just an incredibly boring discussion. But what the researchers want to know is, will the women who underwent this severe initiation, who embarrassed themselves in front of the male experimenter, will they feel a need to justify having suffered by convincing themselves that in fact they really like this group discussion? So this graph shows their ratings of how much they enjoyed the group discussion. And if you look first off in the no initiation condition, the control condition, these women correctly stated that they really hated the discussion. It really wasn't fun at all. And the women in the mild initiation similarly report saying that the discussion was no fun at all. They didn't like it at all. But the women in the severe initiation report really liking that discussion, even though it's the exact same discussion that the women in the other 2 groups heard. So why did these women really like that discussion? Well, assuming that the study was conducted properly, then the only explanation we have for why they liked the group discussion more was due to the initiation itself. In other words, it helps to support the initial hypothesis the researchers had, that undergoing a severe initiation led these women to feel a need to justify why they suffered in order to join that group. And how they justified it is they convinced themselves that they really did like the discussion. Because if they really liked the discussion, then it was worth it having embarrassed themselves a minute ago. We already mentioned this, but some research has shown that people who undergo these sorts of hazing rituals or these initiations in order to join a group will tend to end up liking that group more once they actually join it, which at first glance sort of seems a little counterintuitive. I mean, if you think about it, this group is putting you through suffering before you join it. So if they're making you suffer, it seems common sense that we would like the group less, right? Because they made you suffer. But in reality, what's happening is people like it more. And the reason for this is due to social psychology. Because once you have suffered to join a group, you're going to feel a need to justify why you suffered, which you will do by convincing yourself you like the group more. So the researcher who came up with cognitive dissonance theory, his name is Leon Festinger, he was aware of this prediction that his theory made, that if you suffer for something to join a group, you're going to end up liking the group more, or you'll have to justify having suffered for it. And he became aware of a cult that was operating at the time. This is back in the 1950s. The cult was called the Seekers. And the Seekers were led by a woman by the name of Miriam Keach. And Miriam Keach claimed to be in contact with an alien race called the Guardians. And according to Miriam's conversations with the Guardians, it was her belief that the world was going to end in a worldwide flood that was going to kill everything on the planet on December 21st, 1954. But fortunately, the guardians that she was in contact with, she believed they were going to come with their spaceship on midnight the night before, so the midnight of December 20th, and they were going to take all of the cult members, all of the seekers on board the spaceship and save them from the impending flood. That was the belief that she and the seekers had. But Leon Festinger, when he heard of this, was pretty sure those beliefs were wrong. He was pretty sure that was not going to happen. But the thing is that in order to join the group, the seekers, these people had to cut off their family and their friends, right? Because they're being ridiculed by their family and friends. And so they were told to cut them off, cut them out of their lives. And they were told to quit their jobs and quit school and sell all your possessions to join this group. So they basically had to undergo an immense amount of suffering, in a sense, right? Or an immense amount of effort, like a lot of time and money and things like that. They had to sacrifice in order to join this group. So what Leon Festinger was interested in is what's going to happen? How are these people going to deal psychologically when everything they've believed is proven to be false when this flood doesn't come on the 21st? How are they going to deal with the massive amounts of cognitive dissonance that are going to be created if they were to simply accept that they were wrong, and yet they sold all their possessions and cut off their friends and everything else? To investigate this, he went undercover as a cult member. He joined the cult. And so in his dealings with the cults, they'd all decided to get together the night of December 20th, okay? They were gonna wait in this one room for the spaceship to come so they can get on board and it would save them before the world ends in a giant flood. And so they're all gathering in this room in the hours before midnight. And all of a sudden they realize that they're not allowed to take metal on board the space shuttle or the spaceship. So the men realize that they've got like metal zippers in their pants. They're cutting out the zippers of their pants. And the women realize that their underwires are in their bras have metal. So they're cutting out the underwires of their bras. They start memorizing passwords to get on board these spaceships. I mean, these people are really into it. And they all gather in this room. Everything gets quiet a few minutes before midnight. Okay, this is the moment that their whole life has been leading up to, effectively, right? Since they joined this cult anyway. And this is the moment that Leon Festinger has been waiting for. Like, how are these people going to react when it's proven that their beliefs are wrong? And the clock strikes midnight, and nothing happens. 5 minutes after midnight, and 10 minutes after midnight, 15 minutes after midnight, nothing happens. And people are getting really, really tense around the room, right? And it's 12:30, and it's 1 in the morning, and it's 2 in the morning, and it's 3 in the morning, and people are freaking out, right? People are crying, and people are really stressed out, and they don't know how to deal with this because they completely 100% with all of their hearts believe that this spaceship was coming and the flood is coming in just a matter of hours, and then the spaceship's not here, and they don't know what's happening. And at 4 in the morning, Miriam Keach goes into another room, and she comes back a few minutes later, and she says, "Hey, I have good news. I've just talked to the Guardians just now, and they have told me that because we have spread so much light in the world about our cause, that the Guardians have decided to stop the flood, and that's why they haven't come." Now, if we think about this, that's ridiculous, right? Like, that's clearly a justification for their wrong beliefs. Like, clearly they're just wrong, right? But that's from us on the outside. To these people who had sacrificed so much in order to join this cult for their beliefs, they were looking for something to latch onto. They were looking for a way to reduce the cognitive dissonance that was going to destroy them psychologically. And this gave them a way of reducing that dissonance. It gave them something to latch onto. If they could believe that they saved the world by spreading so much light into the world, then that justifies all of the suffering they went through, all of the effort. It justifies why they quit their job and quit school and cut off their friends, because they saved the world. So they start celebrating and high-fiving and cheering and applauding and everything else. So they truly believed that they had saved the world, right? Because that was what they latched onto in order to reduce or to eliminate the cognitive dissonance that would have been created had they just recognized that their beliefs were wrong. And you can see that this is also related to belief perseverance, right? Because what these people are doing is that in the face of disconfirmation, they're maintaining their beliefs, they're clinging on to their beliefs, which is exactly what belief perseverance is. So we can also see a link between cognitive dissonance and belief perseverance, that part of the reason our beliefs tend to persevere is because if we admit that our past beliefs were wrong, then that creates a lot of cognitive dissonance within us. And we want to avoid that. So we cling to our beliefs and we delude ourselves a lot of the time in order to avoid that cognitive dissonance. Yeah, so like People's Temple and Kool-Aid. Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of examples of all sorts of cults in which similar things have happened. That's a common occurrence, I think, in cults. Is by getting cult members to sacrifice something to join the cult that makes them more psychologically willing to buy into those beliefs. You can see the cognitive dissonance in quotes from the cult members themselves, in fact. So these are quotes from the cult members prior to December 21st. Okay, so this is before they realized the spaceship wasn't coming. They still thought the spaceship was coming at the time. So here's one quote. I have to believe the flood is coming on the 21st because I've spent all my money. I quit my job. I quit computer school. I have to believe. But how does any of that make sense? Like, what they're saying is, I have to believe a flood is going to wipe out the world because I've spent my money. That doesn't make any logical sense, right? Like, why does the fact that you quit your job or quit computer school, why does that lead you to believe a flood is coming? But it makes sense from the perspective of cognitive dissonance theory. Because what they're saying is, because I spent all that effort, I have to justify it somehow. I have to believe, because that's the only way I have of justifying why I quit my job and why I quit computer school and why I spent all my money. Or here's another one. I've had to go a long way. I've given up just about everything. I've cut every tie. I've burned every bridge. I've turned my back on the world. I can't afford to doubt. I have to believe, and there isn't any other truth. Again, they're not saying, I believe the flood is coming or the spaceship is coming because of the evidence or because of the logic behind it. They're saying I have to believe it because I've burned every bridge. I've turned my back on the world. I can't afford to doubt. What they're saying is I can't afford to doubt psychologically, because if I doubt, then I can't justify all these things that I did in the past. Someone asked, is it like when we convince ourselves the sacrifice is worth the result? Yeah, that's kind of like it, right? So if you go through some hardship or something, we have a tendency to justify having gone through that hardship. So we convince ourselves that the sacrifice was worth it. Yeah, that's right. Okay, so that is how we see cognitive dissonance arise in conditions in which we have to justify our past effort. There's a third domain in which we tend to see cognitive dissonance effects as well, and that's when we have to justify difficult decisions that we have to make. So there are many times in life where we've got a decision between two or more options. It could be something like, which car do I want to buy? Or which school do I want to go to? Or if you're lucky, which of these two people do I want to date? When we have those difficult decisions to make, we can struggle with them for a while. And we don't really know which decision to make, and we're kind of nervous we're going to make the wrong decision, right? Well, what happens is that once you make a decision, the moment you make that decision, you become psychologically motivated to justify that decision. Because let's say that you're choosing between two cars and you pick one car, and as soon as you buy it, as soon as you've committed to it, you realize, oh, wait a second, no, this is the wrong car. I made a bad choice. Man, the regret you feel is going to be amazing, right? Because you've just committed to it. You think of yourself as a good decision maker, as an intelligent person, and yet you are just admitting you just made a bad decision. That's going to create a lot of cognitive dissonance. We don't like that. So once we make a decision, we become psychologically motivated to convince ourselves that that decision was obviously the best one we could have made. And we do that by focusing on only the positives of that decision and only the negatives of the option we didn't take, right? So this is when we justify difficult decisions. When we have roughly equally appealing options, we have to convince ourselves, or we feel a need to convince ourselves, that we made the right decision. I've gone through this myself. So when I was an undergraduate, I was deciding which of two graduate schools to go to. I was debating between Iowa State University and the University of Arizona. And at the time, I struggled with this decision for weeks. I just didn't know which one to go to. And this was going to determine my whole career, my whole life path. I just did not know where to go. At the last minute, I decided to go to Iowa State University. Today, looking back on it, it almost blows my mind that this was even an option. Like, it's so clear to me now that of course I should have gone to Iowa State and it's not the University of Arizona. It wasn't clear to me at the time, but it feels clear to me now. But I also know that the main reason why it feels clear to me now is because I've justified that decision. As soon as I chose Iowa State University, that made me focus on only the positives of Iowa State and the negatives of the University of Arizona. And by focusing on only those qualities, I can now convince myself that of course, I was always meant to go to Iowa State University. That way I never have to feel the regret that I might have to feel if I have to think that I made a wrong choice. Is justifying effort the reason why people who have toxic partners stay with them? Potentially. I mean, there's going to be a number of reasons. It's going to vary from person to person. It's absolutely the case, though, that we have a tendency to justify our past efforts. And so if you have devoted years into a relationship, we feel a need to sort of justify why we did that. So that can be one among many reasons why people stay with toxic partners. Sure. This idea is known as the spreading of alternatives for reasons that will become apparent on the next slide. So I'll come back to that idea in just 1 second. But let me first describe to you a study that demonstrated this effect. So what these researchers did is they went to a mall and they laid out 8 different household appliances. And they stopped people in the mall and said, hey, we're doing some market research. If you could just help us out for a moment, all we want you to do is to rank order these 8 items from most desirable to least desirable. Okay. So different people are obviously going to have different orderings of these 8 items. But as soon as the participant was done ordering those from most to least desirable, then the researcher says something like, okay, well, as a thank you for participating in this market research, we actually have 2 of these products here, and we're willing to give you one as a thank you gift for participating. And they pull out, they say they've got 2 items left. So they pull out the 2 items, and the 2 items they pull out are the items that the participant rated their 4th most desirable product and the 5th most desirable product. Okay, so right in the middle of their list, the 2 items right in the middle of their list, those are the 2 items the researcher says that they have. So you as the participant, you have the choice between these 2 items. Let's say it's the blender and the toaster. Okay, and you choose, they're roughly equal. They're almost exactly equal, your 4th and 5th most desirable items, but for whatever reason, you pick the blender, let's say. Then after you pick the blender, the researchers say, well, thank you. And just before you go, if you could just rate all these items one more time for us. And they re-rate all 8 of those items. So what I'm going to show you in this slide here is the rated attractiveness of the product. So higher bars means they like the product more, lower bars means they liked the product less. So obviously we've got the chosen item and the unchosen item. And before the participant, before the shopper made the choice, as I said, they're about equally rated, right? It's their 4th and 5th most liked items. So they're about equally rated. But what happens is that as soon as that person chooses the blender over the toaster, then all of a sudden that blender becomes much more desirable and the toaster becomes much less desirable. Because as soon as I choose the blender, then I feel the psychological need to justify that choice. Because if I choose the blender and I suddenly realize, oh wait, I should have chosen the toaster. What am I doing? I should have chosen the toaster. Then that calls into question my abilities as a decision maker, and I don't like that, right? That's going to create a lot of cognitive dissonance. So to avoid that dissonance, I convince myself, of course, the blender is of course I need a blender really badly, right? And all you think about are all the good parts of the blender and the negative parts of the toaster, right? To convince yourself you made the right choice. So the blender gets more attractive and the toaster gets less attractive. And this is why this is called the spreading of alternatives, because the ratings of the alternative products, of the 2 products, which are very close to begin with, they spread out as soon as you make a choice. And there's other evidence that is consistent with this idea as well. In fact, there's some evidence that shows that if you look at people who are in committed dating relationships, they have a tendency to see other potential dating partners as less attractive than they did when they were single, which sort of makes sense, right? Because if you're single, you have all these options in front of you. As soon as you commit to being with one person monogamously, you are choosing that person over everybody else. And because we feel a need to justify our choices, our decisions, we, at least at the beginning of a relationship, all we do is focus on all the positive aspects of our current partner, and we see other people as less attractive because that tends to justify our choice. Now, obviously, over time, as you get to know someone better, obviously that can deteriorate, right? But at least at the beginning of a relationship, that tends to happen, that we tend to see other people as less attractive. What do you call it when someone can't make a choice? Yeah, that does happen. In fact, there's actually an ironic effect whereby the more options that you give people to choose from, the harder it is for them to make a choice, and the less satisfied they tend to be with their choice, it turns out. Because what happens is that if you have to choose from 10 different options, if you pick one, well, it's possible the other 9 options could have been better, right? So people get kind of nervous about that. But if you can only choose between one of 2 options, it's easier to justify that decision. It's called like what is it called? The paradox of choice, I think. The paradox of choice, where the more options you have to choose from, the less satisfied we tend to be, interestingly enough. Now, all this being said, although cognitive dissonance arises whenever our attitudes don't match our behaviors, we don't always experience cognitive dissonance. There's a few components that have to be present for us to experience dissonance. And I just want to quickly go over those. First off, for dissonance to occur, the behavior we engage in, the behavior that's in conflict with our past attitudes, that behavior has to produce some sort of negative consequence. So, I think I'm an honest person, but I just lied to someone else and told them how much fun a study was. That was the original cognitive dissonance experiment. Well, if I lied to someone else, and that calls into question whether I'm an honest person, it's a negative consequence to my self-concept. I have to think more negatively of myself, right? If there's no negative consequence, if I behave in a way that conflicts with an attitude, but there's no actual negative outcome that happens as a consequence, I don't have to feel bad about it. So if the behavior doesn't produce negative consequences, we don't experience cognitive dissonance. Secondly, we have to feel, when we engage in that behavior, we have to feel like personally responsible for it. We have to feel like we freely chose to engage in that behavior. So in every single cognitive dissonance study that we've talked about and all the ones that have been conducted, the participant has to feel like they willingly, freely chose to engage in that behavior. So in the original cognitive dissonance study, for instance, where people were asked to lie to someone else to tell them how much fun the study was, they weren't told they had to lie to that person. Because if you're told you have to do something, you didn't freely choose the behavior, you're not going to feel guilty about it. But the participants are always led to feel like they chose to engage in that behavior. So that way they feel personally responsible for their behavior. And that feeling of personal responsibility is required in order to experience cognitive dissonance effects. Someone said, how do you describe the negatives in the examples of the 2 universities? It could be like the location. Maybe I liked one location better than another. Or it could be like the person I worked with have different specialties. So I could think about the negatives of going into one subfield versus another subfield of psychology. There's a whole bunch of different aspects, negatives or positive aspects of universities that you can think about. A third necessary component of cognitive dissonance is physiological arousal, because by definition, cognitive dissonance is that physiological arousal, meaning it's measurable. You can measure that arousal, that uncomfortable feeling that we get when our behavior conflicts with our attitudes. And that's going to be a really important idea to understand in the next 15 minutes. So we're going to come back to this point. And finally, I'm just going to mention this one kind of quickly. When we have that uncomfortable feeling, when we engage in a behavior that conflicts with our attitudes and that leads us to feel uncomfortable, we have to realize that the reason we're feeling uncomfortable is due to our own behavior. If we think we're feeling uncomfortable for another reason, just because we're sick or something, then we don't engage in these cognitive dissonance reduction strategies. So it's only when we realize that the reason we're feeling bad, we're feeling that negative physiological arousal, is due to our behavior, which conflicted with our attitudes, that's what tends to prompt us to engage in these cognitive dissonance reduction strategies. But as I mentioned, the most important idea here is this third point, the fact that we have to experience physiological arousal to experience cognitive dissonance. And the reason for that is because when cognitive dissonance theory was created in the 1950s, it led to like hundreds and hundreds of studies. There were a ton of implications that were now being researched by various social psychologists. For the next like 15 years, that was the case. But in 1972, a researcher came along by the name of Daryl Bem, and he proposed something sort of radical, because what he said is that he can explain every single cognitive dissonance study that had been conducted to date, but he can do it with a different theory, and his theory was better. That's what he said. And his theory was self-perception theory. In fact, we've seen self-perception theory already in this class. If you recall, self-perception theory states that we learn about ourselves by thinking about our past behavior and coming to a rational inference, a rational conclusion about what our attitude must be. So the example I used earlier, I think, is if you're trying to figure out what music you like, well, if you think, well, I listen to country music every day on the drive to work, therefore I must like country music. So you think about your past behavior, you come to a rational conclusion about what your attitude must be. Now, I didn't mention this at the time, but self-perception theory was proposed as an alternative to cognitive dissonance theory. In particular, Daryl Bem is saying that his self-perception theory can explain every single finding in the cognitive dissonance literature, but he can do it in a way that's better than cognitive dissonance theory, because he can do it without the need to assume that people experience physiological arousal. So I don't know if you remember, but at the beginning of the semester, we talked about certain criteria that make a good scientific theory. And one of those criteria was simplicity. We want a good scientific theory should be one that is simple. By simple, I mean it's one that doesn't require us to assume things that we don't have evidence for. And so what had happened up until this point is that all of these cognitive dissonance studies had been conducted, but no one had actually measured if people actually experienced this physiological arousal. And so when Bem came along with self-perception theory, he said, look, I can explain these findings and I don't have to assume that people experience physiological arousal. I can explain all the effects without assuming that. And because I'm assuming less things than cognitive dissonance theory, therefore my theory is better. That's what he said. So let's take a look at how self-perception theory explains cognitive dissonance effects. We're going to revisit the classic study. This is the original study. Okay, this is the study we talked about last class, where participants engaged in a really boring task, and they then had to, or I guess I should say, they were then randomly assigned to one of three conditions. One group of people never lied to anyone else. A second group of people lied to another participant and told them how much fun the study was for $1. And a third group of people lied to someone else and told them how much fun the study was for $20. And if you recall, what that original study showed is that the people who lied to someone else and told them how much fun the study was for $1 came to convince themselves that they really did like that study. They really did like that boring study. And I explained this at the time in terms of cognitive dissonance theory. I'd explained that the explanation that Leon Festinger came up with in cognitive dissonance theory was that these people thought of themselves as honest people, but they just lied to someone else. And they can't say they did it for the money because they were only paid $1. So they had to justify why they lied to someone. And the way that they justified it is by convincing themselves that in fact they really actually like the study. Because if they can convince themselves they like the study, they didn't really lie. Right? But the people in the $20 condition, they didn't do that because they knew they lied to someone else, but because they were paid $20, they had sufficient justification. They felt okay. They were willing to lie for $20. They had enough motivation. But because the $1 people didn't have that motivation, they had to convince themselves they really liked the study. That was the explanation I gave when we talked about cognitive dissonance. But a self-perception theorist would explain this somewhat differently. They would say the following. So imagine you're a participant in this study, and you went through this really boring task. You told someone else how much fun the study was, and you were paid $20 to do so. And you're then asked, how do you feel about this study? What is your true attitude? And you start to think, well, a minute ago, I told someone else how much fun this study was, but I was paid $20 to do so. So I probably only said that for the money. So I probably didn't actually like the study after all. So note that what's happening here is people are coming to a rational conclusion, right, about what their attitude is. On the other hand, people who lied to someone else for $1 and they're later asked, what is your attitude? Did you like this study? They start thinking, well, a minute ago, I told someone else how much fun the study was. And I was only paid $1 to do it. So I guess I didn't do it for the money. So I guess if I said the study was really fun, I guess I must have really had a lot of fun in the study. So you can see here that these people are coming to a rational conclusion about what their attitude must be according to self-perception theory. This is the key difference between these two theories. With cognitive dissonance theory, it says that people are justifying and rationalizing their behaviors. And they're doing so to get rid of that negative arousal, like cognitive dissonance. Okay? A self-perception theorist says there's no rationalizing, there's no justification, and there's no negative arousal. All that's happening is that people are trying to figure out what their attitudes are, and they're thinking about their past behavior. And they're coming to a rational conclusion about what their behavior or what their attitude must be based on that past behavior. If I told someone else how much fun the study was, and I was only paid $1 to do so, I didn't do it for the money, so I guess I must really like the study. Can it be both? Sort of. We're going to talk in just a minute about the conditions under which each theory holds. So we're going to come back to that. So last class, for instance, I told you about a study where kids were given the opportunity to cheat, and some cheated and some didn't on a test. And then later, when the researchers asked the kids about their attitudes towards cheating, what they showed is that the kids who had just cheated a few minutes ago came to develop much more positive attitudes towards cheating. And we had explained that in terms of cognitive dissonance theory. So basically the idea is that, well, if I just cheated 5 minutes ago, if I say I'm against cheating now, well, my attitude and my behavior don't match. That creates a lot of cognitive dissonance. So if I cheated 5 minutes ago, I have to justify the fact that I cheated, which I justify by saying, cheating is not a big deal at all. That's the cognitive dissonance explanation. But the self-perception theory explanation is that when these kids are asked, what is your attitude towards cheating? They basically go, well, 5 minutes ago I cheated, so I guess I must have a pretty positive attitude towards cheating, right? They're coming to a rational conclusion about what their attitude is based on their past behavior. But notice in that explanation, they're not justifying anything. They're not rationalizing anything. There's no negative arousal they're trying to get rid of, right? They're just coming to a rational conclusion. And you could take any other finding that we've talked about in cognitive dissonance terms, and we can explain it in terms of these self-perception terms as well. So we talked about a study where kids who were given a mild threat to not play with a toy that they wanted to play with, they came to convince themselves they never wanted to play with a toy anyway. And we talked about that in terms of cognitive dissonance theory, because these kids really wanted to play with a toy, but they didn't play with a toy. They had to justify why they didn't play with a toy, which they did by convincing themselves they never wanted to play with it in the first place. So that was a way to justify their behavior. But a self-perception theorist would say that's not what happened at all. What happened is that when the kids were trying to figure out, did they want to still play with this toy? They thought back and they said, well, a minute ago, I was able to play with this toy. There was a toy that was there and I didn't play with it. And it's not because I was given a severe threat, because I was given a mild threat. So why didn't I play with that toy? It must be because I never wanted to play with it in the first place. So they come to a rational conclusion that they don't want to play with the toy. And we can do the same thing for justifying effort or justifying difficult decisions. So for instance, for justifying effort, if you think about that sex discussion study that I talked about, where women convinced themselves they really liked the group discussion if they had undergone a severe initiation. We talked about that in terms of cognitive dissonance theory, that the woman had to justify having gone through that initiation, which they did by convincing themselves they liked the discussion. But a self-perception theorist would simply say that's not what happened at all. What happened is that when women are trying to figure out what is my attitude towards that discussion, they think, well, a few minutes ago, I chose willingly to undergo this really severe initiation just to join the group. And I wouldn't do that unless I really liked the group and really liked the discussion. So I guess I must really have liked that discussion. Okay, so on the exam, I might ask you to explain something from a cognitive dissonance perspective and from a self-perception perspective. And when you do that, here's the key to answering that question. When you're explaining something in terms of cognitive dissonance theory, you can use words like rationalize and justify, and you're motivated to reduce negative arousal. That's fine. That's what cognitive dissonance theory is all about. It's how we justify things to reduce our cognitive dissonance. When you're talking about self-perception theory, you should not use any of those terms. You're never justifying or rationalizing anything with self-perception theory. All you're doing is thinking about your past behavior, coming to a rational conclusion about what your attitude must be. It's a much more rational process and not a justifying process. Okay, so keep that in mind. Okay, so which of these theories is correct? Well, it turns out that both theories are correct. They both apply to how we make decisions and things like that in somewhat different contexts. And the basic idea is that if you engage in a behavior that's very, very different from your attitude, so the discrepancy between the behavior and attitude is large, then we feel cognitive dissonance. So if going into the 2020 election, no, so cognitive dissonance is justifying and rationalizing. Self-perception is also not rationalizing, okay? Self-perception is rational. You come to a rational conclusion, okay? But you're not rationalizing. So keep that in mind. So let's say that you, in the 2020 election, you were a big Bernie Sanders fan, okay? Who's a left-wing politician. But in the election, you actually voted for Donald Trump. So your attitude and your behavior don't match. And those are very, very different perspectives. They're very, very different, right? When that happens, when that discrepancy is large, then we feel cognitive dissonance. Then we feel a motivation to eliminate that cognitive dissonance. That's when we feel a need to justify our past behaviors. But let's say instead that you were a Bernie Sanders supporter, then you voted for Joe Biden, who's also a Democrat. They're both Democrats, right? The discrepancy between your attitude and your behavior that you were canvassing for Bernie Sanders, but you voted for Joe Biden is smaller, right? The discrepancy is smaller. When discrepancy is small, we don't feel a need to justify our behaviors if our behaviors aren't that discrepant from our attitudes. That's when self-perception theory kicks in. That's when we infer what our attitudes must be by thinking about our past behavior. So both of the theories are correct in the sense that they both exist and they both adequately explain people's behavior. They just explain it in different contexts. Cognitive dissonance when the discrepancy between behavior and attitude is large, and self-perception when the discrepancy is small. So just to summarize the section, not only do our attitudes influence our behaviors, which is the normal way we have of thinking about things, but the behaviors we engage in can influence our attitudes. They can lead us to develop attitudes consistent with those behaviors. And they can do so in two different ways. According to cognitive dissonance theory, it says that when we engage in a behavior that conflicts with an attitude, we feel a need to justify that behavior because we experience that negative arousal, that feeling of cognitive dissonance that we want to get rid of. And we can get rid of it by justifying our past behavior, by convincing ourselves that we didn't actually behave in a manner contradictory to our attitudes. And self-perception theory explains attitude change somewhat differently. So if you engage in behavior that conflicts with your attitude, the reason your attitude changes is because you think about your past behavior and you come to the rational conclusion about what your attitude must be based on your past behavior. Okay, and I apologize. I know I'm kind of rushing through this lecture because I want to make absolutely sure that I'm getting everything in before the end of class today. And I also have a quiz I want to give. So let's go into Top Hat. So we have time to take a quiz. And if there's any time at the end, I can go over any questions you have about the material. And remember, if anyone's having any Top Hat issues, you can always text your responses. I have been told from people in my 2 o'clock class, some of them have been told or just found out today that they don't have an account anymore. And the reason for that is because they didn't get an access code from the library yet. So if you're part of the Panther book pack, and you paid for an account, you're getting a refund for the money you paid for that account. But you have to also get an access code from the bookstore. Okay. If you haven't yet gotten an access code from the bookstore, please do so ASAP. But if you didn't, you might get that message saying that you don't have an account. And if you get that message, that's why. But regardless, it doesn't matter. Even if that's the case, you can always text your responses. So just remember to text your responses to the phone number in the upper left here, and make sure you're using this 4-digit code. Don't use the join code, okay? It's just the 4-digit code that you're going to use to text your responses if you want to do that. So here we go. Question 1. According to cognitive dissonance theory, why do people like a fraternity more if they underwent severe hazing? So for instance, they suffered through a strict initiation in order to join it. This is because people feel a need to justify their desire to haze the next group of people, because they infer that they must like the group if they went through all that suffering, because downplaying their suffering makes them appear capable to other people, or because it's a way to justify having gone through all of that suffering. And you've got 10 seconds. 3, 2, 1. And Angel, yeah, that's what I'm saying, is that if you text and it says it requires a subscription, then probably what happened is that you are part of the book pack and you haven't gotten an access code yet, is my guess. If you have issues, we can always talk about them at the end of the quiz though. But even if you don't have a subscription, it doesn't matter. You can still, I think you can still text your responses, so still do that. So Simone, you said B and D feel similar. Well, that's because one of them is a cognitive dissonance explanation, which is D, and one of them is a self-perception explanation, which is B. So basically, according to cognitive dissonance theory, people have to justify why they went through all that suffering, which they do by convincing themselves they like the group more. B is the self-perception explanation. People are inferring, coming to the conclusion that they must like the group if they went through all that suffering. Yeah, I think you can text if you don't have a subscription. I think that's fine. It may not appear in my grade book until you get the subscription, but I think it'll still take it. So regardless, do it anyway. Okay, question 2. Hang on. For self-perception, how would the woman in the study enjoy the discussion because of severe initiation? Okay. Oh, no, it's not. No, it's not that they would do it before they know what the discussion's about. Remember, the women are only asked how much they enjoy the discussion after the discussion itself, right? So they undergo the initiation or not, they join the discussion, and afterwards they're asked, how much did you like the discussion? And according to self-perception theory, what those women are doing at that time is they're saying, well, I underwent that severe initiation in order to join that discussion, and I wouldn't do that unless I really liked the group, so therefore I must have liked that discussion. Question 2, when severe and mild threats were used in an attempt to prevent children from engaging in a prohibited activity, which of the following happened? Only the severe threat was strong enough to deter the children from engaging in the prohibited activity. And just in case you don't know, deter, deterring, deterred, that means preventing them from engaging in the activity. B, both threats deterred the children, but those given the mild threat showed greater internalization of the rule. C, both threats deterred the children, but those given the severe threat showed greater internalization of the rule. Or D, neither threat was successful in getting the children to internalize the rule. And you've got 10 seconds. 3, 2, 1. Okay, this one might be a little tricky. See how you guys did. Okay, so this is the study we talked about last class, where kids were given either a severe or mild threat to not play with a desired toy. And both the severe and mild threat were enough to get the kids to not play with the toy. Okay, so we know that either B or C has to be correct because both threats deterred the children. But you guys are right, that those given the mild threat showed greater internalization of the rule, meaning those kids who were given the mild threat came to convince themselves that in fact they never wanted to play with the toy in the first place as a way to reduce their cognitive dissonance. The kids who were given the severe threat, they didn't play with the toy, but they knew exactly why they weren't playing with the toys, because of the threat itself. So they never came to convince themselves that they didn't want to play with the toy. That's why B is correct. Question 3. Leslie has a belief that she is a very hardworking student, but the night before a big exam, instead of studying, she plays video games for 3 hours. This causes her cognitive dissonance. If she were to reduce her dissonance by adding a consonant cognition, which of the following might she do? Convince herself that she already knows the material and therefore doesn't need to study. B, convince herself that the exam isn't that important anyway. C, convince herself that she had to play video games with her younger brother because he needed someone to play with. Or D, convince herself that playing video games allows her to relax so that she can concentrate better later. Emily, after you select a response option, are you hitting submit afterwards? Okay, in that case, I don't know. Hang around after class and I can check your scores and I can manually change them if I need to. Okay, 10 seconds. 3, 2, 1. All right, so all of these are ways that Leslie could reduce her cognitive dissonance. They're not all adding a constant cognition though. So for instance, convincing herself that the exam isn't that important is minimizing the importance of the conflict. Convincing herself that she had to play because her younger brother needed someone to play with is reducing perceived choice. D is probably the best answer here. Convince herself that playing video games allows her to relax, because that is adding a new belief that is consistent with her attitudes and her behavior, right? It's adding the belief that, well, if I play video games, then that's good for my exam studying because I'll be able to relax. That being said, I would also accept A, now that I think about it. Because if she can convince herself that she knows the material and therefore doesn't need to study, that's also adding a new belief that's consistent with the fact that she's playing video games and not studying. So actually either A or D would work here. Question 4. One of the main differences between cognitive dissonance theory and self-perception theory is that in self-perception theory, there's no motivation, there's no attitude change. People change their attitudes only if other people are present, or attitude change is only temporary. We've got 10 seconds. 3, 2, 1. All right, so this one's a little bit trickier. Okay, so yeah, this one's actually quite tricky because the correct answer is the least commonly answered question or response option. A is the correct answer, it turns out. So here's the idea. I knew this was going to be a little tricky because what I said was that in self-perception theory, there's no arousal, there's no physiological arousal, right? That you're trying to reduce. It's just an inference, a logical inference you're making. Yeah, but here's the issue. In cognitive dissonance theory, you experience that cognitive dissonance, and that leads you to be motivated to reduce it. In self-perception theory, because there's no cognitive dissonance, there's nothing to reduce. You're not motivated to reduce anything. You're just coming to a rational conclusion. You're not motivated, you're not trying to come to a predetermined conclusion like you are with cognitive dissonance theory. So when I say there's no motivation, what I'm saying is there's no motivation to reduce cognitive dissonance. There's no motivation to reduce that negative arousal. Yeah, that's exactly right. Cognitive dissonance makes you uncomfortable. Self-perception, you're just observing what you did. That's exactly right. And finally, question 5. Self-perception theory explains attitude change when what? A, people know what their true attitudes are. B, the discrepancy between behavior and attitude is small. C, when the behavior produces negative consequences. Or D, when people feel personally responsible for their attitude change. And you've got 10 seconds. 3, 2, 1. Obviously, this is what we just went over at the very end of the lecture, and I mentioned that cognitive dissonance occurs when the discrepancy between behavior and attitude is large, and self-perception explains attitude change when the discrepancy between attitude and behavior is small. That concerns me. That again, for 2 questions in a row, it's the least commonly answered response option. It's a good thing these are quizzes and you guys are only graded on participation and not accuracy. But check the second last slide of the lecture. That's exactly what it says. Self-perception theory occurs when the discrepancy between behavior and attitude is small. The feeling of personal responsibility is necessary for cognitive dissonance to occur, but that has nothing to do with self-perception theory. Okay, remember that next class, which is not next Monday, but the Monday after, because next week is spring break. Next class is exam number 2. Okay, so keep that in mind. Have a great spring break, and I will see you guys then. I'll hang around for the next couple minutes also if anyone has any issues with Top Hat or whatever. All right, have a good one, guys.